At 35,000 feet, a state-of-the-art Airbus A330 crosses the Atlantic heading toward France. In just a few seconds, the night's tranquility turns into a nightmare. The aircraft begins to plummet rapidly, taking the 228 souls on board straight toward the ocean. What happened? This is what is known. It is June 1st, 2009, at Galeão International Airport in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Around 7 in the evening, 216 passengers, along with 12 crew members, are preparing to board Air France Flight 447 with a final destination of Paris. The Airbus A330 is a wide-body aircraft governed by advanced electronic control systems. Its reputation was impeccable. Since it began operating in 1994, it had never suffered a fatal accident. At the front of the cockpit is Captain Marc Dubois, 58, a veteran pilot with nearly 11,000 flight hours, more than 6,200 of them as captain, including 1,700 on this specific aircraft model. Alongside him is First Officer Pierre Cédric, 32, who joined Air France in 2003 and had accumulated nearly 3,000 flight hours, over 800 of them on the A330. Also accompanying them is Second Officer David Robert, 37, who joined the airline in 1998 with more than 6,500 hours, roughly 4,500 of which were on this aircraft. His role would be to relieve the captain during part of the flight so the latter could rest. Of the 12 crew members, 11 were French and 1 Brazilian. Among the passengers, most were citizens of France, Brazil, or Germany, traveling either for business or leisure. The Rio route was especially popular among Air France pilots, as it included a 3-day stay in front of Copacabana Beach, a perfect opportunity to relax, enjoy restaurants, and explore the city. On this flight, the first officer had brought his wife, while the captain was accompanied by his partner, a flight attendant who was also a singer. Subsequent reports revealed that the captain had slept only an hour before takeoff, after spending the previous night enjoying the city. Despite their fatigue, all three trusted the capabilities of their aircraft. The A330 was built with safeguards to prevent extreme maneuvers, and had a system allowing the entire flight plan to be entered on the ground, letting the plane fly almost automatically until shortly before landing. The pilot's main role was therefore to supervise and make key decisions in case of unforeseen events. At 7:29 p.m., Flight 447 takes off from Rio and begins climbing to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The first officer is at the controls, although he does not need to intervene much because the autopilot performs most of the work, while the captain monitors the instruments. The second officer rests in the crew area, preparing for his shift. After passing over Natal and entering the Atlantic, the cabin atmosphere is relaxed. More than an hour has passed and everything seems normal. Around 10:30 p.m., the Brazilian Oceanic Control Center makes the last communication with them, instructing the flight to maintain its current altitude of 35,000 feet. They would never speak with anyone on the ground again. The first officer observes a long line of storms ahead on the weather radar. This area, known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, is infamous for frequent cumulonimbus clouds and lightning. The crew had crossed this corridor many times before, and usually avoided the worst by climbing slightly. This time, the first officer is uneasy and considers requesting permission to ascend, but air traffic control had instructed them to maintain level. The captain, however, decides it is unnecessary. He believes that climbing to 37,000 feet would not improve conditions and that their current altitude is safe. In the worst-case scenario, he imagines they would encounter only turbulence or some icing, confident they could adjust the route to avoid the worst parts. Once over the ocean, far from any airport, the flight is out of range of ground radar. In this region, flight safety is maintained through specific altitude levels, odd levels for northbound flights, even levels for southbound. The next available odd level was 37,000 feet, the maximum altitude they could reach. The first officer considers requesting a different altitude, around 36,000 feet, but ultimately decides against it. Minutes later, the captain decides to rest and calls a second officer to take over. The first officer briefs him on the situation. They are flying at 35,000 feet. There is a storm ahead, and attempts to contact Dakar have failed. 6 minutes later, noticing the clouds ahead, the relief pilot suggests slightly diverting to the left. However, with two first officers in the cockpit and the less experienced one in command, the chain of command is unclear. The suggestion goes unanswered and no action is taken. At that moment, a smell of ozone begins to fill the cabin. It is a normal phenomenon when passing through electrically charged cumulonimbus clouds, but it unnerves the first officer. While not unusual on transatlantic flights, this time it causes him concern. During the past few minutes, they have flown through a cloud with abundant ice crystals at the upper levels of the storm. Normally, this would not pose a problem, but if the crystals are dense, they can block the airspeed sensors known as pitot tubes. These devices are heated, but when ice accumulates suddenly, it can block the sensors before the heaters can melt it. The A330 has 3 pitot tubes, one for each pilot and one as a backup, that compare dynamic pressure with static pressure to calculate airspeed. If blocked, readings become inaccurate. On Flight 447, all 3 pitot tubes freeze, producing unreliable airspeed data. When significant discrepancies are detected, the autopilot disconnects with a sudden alarm. The auto-thrust system also disengages, surprising the first officer at the controls. Suddenly, he must fly the aircraft manually amid turbulence. The plane begins to bank to the right, and he counters by turning left. But due to a change in the aircraft's configuration, the controls respond too sensitively, causing the plane to oscillate violently from side to side. He also pulls the control column back, raising the nose with excessive force. Immediately, the stall warning sounds as the critical angle of attack has been exceeded. The airspeed drops from 274 knots to barely 52. The aircraft climbs uncontrollably, reaching 38,000 feet, far above its normal cruising altitude. At this moment, the climb rate is abnormal, almost 7,000 feet per minute, whereas a typical A330 ascends around 2,000 feet per minute. Although the pitot problem lasts just over a minute and readings then return to normal, the first officer continues to hold the control column back, forcing the horizontal stabilizer into a position that remains fixed for the rest of the flight. By 11:11 p.m., the aircraft reaches its maximum, with the nose elevated about 16 degrees and engines at full power. Shortly afterward, it begins to descend with the nose pointing upward at roughly 30 degrees. With multiple systems lost, the automatic protections that would normally prevent such an extreme attitude are no longer functioning. The first officer, overwhelmed, exclaims that he can no longer control the aircraft. The second officer takes over, attempting to push the nose down to regain speed, but the other continues to pull back. At that moment, the captain returns to the cockpit and finds the plane plunging at 10,000 feet per minute, with the nose at a 40-degree angle upward. The only way to recover would be to lower the nose and gain speed, but the first officer insists on pulling back. The plane continues to fall uncontrollably. The captain, desperate, shouts for him not to climb, but it is already too late. With a speed of only 107 knots and a descent exceeding 11,000 feet per minute, Air France Flight 447 crashes violently into the Atlantic. Post-accident investigations revealed that the pilots were bewildered by the sudden loss of airspeed data and acted in a disorganized manner until they completely lost control. The frozen airspeed sensors caused the automatic systems to disconnect, providing confusing information to the co-pilots. While the captain was absent, one of the co-pilots pulled the control column back, taking the plane out of its safe flight envelope and into a stall they could not identify. Despite multiple stall warnings, including one that lasted continuously for 54 seconds, they failed to recognize the danger. The A330 is normally equipped with protections against such situations, but when all airspeed data was lost, it reverted to manual behavior, functioning like a conventional aircraft without electronic assistance. Investigators concluded that the pilots likely believed they were facing an overspeed condition, misinterpreting stall vibrations as something else. The accident led to recommendations for improved high-altitude training and enhanced cockpit equipment. Air France replaced components in its fleet to prevent a recurrence. All 228 people on board lost their lives.